Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and Pew Research Center. This is the first webinar in a two-part series that we are doing together. And today's webinar is focused on COVID-19 discrimination and hate. Is anti-Asian American harassment on the rise? A new Pew Research Center survey has found that Asian Americans are more likely to report adverse experiences due to their race or ethnicity since the pandemic began. So during this webinar, Pew Research Center's Associate Director of Global Migration and Demography and lead author of this report will present research on race and discrimination. And we will discuss the rise in discrimination and hate against Asian American communities and communities of color during the COVID-19 pandemic, research and key findings from Pew Research Center, and national efforts to track and respond to hate, and more. We are joined by two wonderful colleagues in research and anti-hate efforts today. Neil G. Ruiz is Associate Director of Global Migration and Demography at the Pew Research Center. He studies the international movement of people across borders, high-skilled immigration to the US and around the world, demographic analysis of Asian Americans, and comparative legal immigration systems. Prior to joining the center, Neil was the executive director of the Center for Law, Economics, and Finance at George Washington University. And he has also worked as a migration and economic development expert at the Brookings Institution, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. He is a political economist with a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a master's degree from Oxford University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Neil regularly speaks about U.S. immigration and international migration research with major print and broadcast media. And we're also joined by my colleague, Marita Etkubanez, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Prior to joining Advancing Justice AAJC, Marita was Director of Legal Services for the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center in Washington, D.C. Her 10 years of experience providing direct legal services to low-income communities includes advocating on behalf of migrant and seasonal farm workers with Texas Rural Legal Aid, as well as working with labor pool workers as part of the Homeless Persons Legal Aid. With the Homeless Persons Representation Project in Baltimore, Maryland. Marita holds a law degree and bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan. She is admitted to practice in the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia. We will have Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or you can raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have any questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box and questions box to send us your questions, and I will be sure to repeat this when we get to Q&A. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. We will start with our first speaker, Neil with Pew Research Center.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I will be first off presenting, and let me just get my tech here together. Oh, there it goes. That's showing. Just confirming.
Yes, we see a blank screen right now.
Oh. Okay, sorry, getting my tech together. Start. Is that showing? Yes.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about Asian Americans and discrimination before and since the coronavirus outbreak. First off, just a little bit about Pew Research Center. We're non-advocacy. We don't take policy positions. So we really are we do surveys and demographic work. And we just try to stay away from advocacy because of the fact that we want to make sure that we're giving the voice of the public and exactly what the public is thinking. But what our real goal is about just really generating a foundation of facts to enrich the public dialogue and support sound decision making. We have several 10 research programs. I'm part of the Global Migration Demography team, where we do a lot of work on demographics and migration issues, as well as race and ethnicity in the US. So first off, let me start off by just talking about race and discrimination before the COVID-19 outbreak. Last year, in the spring of 2019, we did a survey on race, and we have some findings there. And then what I'll do after that is really talk about what we released in June with a survey that we did since the pandemic began. So before the pandemic, this is back in spring of 2019, we asked a series of questions, and one of the, just a caveat here, our surveys was able to capture Asian Americans, but those who were interviewed only in English, since the survey was only offered in English and as well as Spanish. In order to do a nationally representative survey for Asian Americans, we would probably have to offer more languages to make sure that we reach out to all the different groups. But this pretty much gives us a really good picture still of the Asian American population in the United States. But first off, non-whites are more likely to see advantages in being white. We asked the question, when it comes to a person's ability to get ahead in our country these days, being white, does it hurt a lot, a little, or help a lot, or a little? And we saw that for Asian Americans in particular, as well as Black Americans and Hispanics, we saw the majority believe that it does help a lot in terms of getting ahead, advantages in the United States. We also asked questions about, since Trump was elected to office since 2017, the majority of the American public actually say it is now more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views. So this, again, since Trump took office, we do have our measures on this question for the general public actually see it's more common. And then we also asked a question about, and this is for each group as well, you see that the majority of Asian Americans and as well as Black Americans and Hispanics say that they're more likely to see their race or ethnicity as actually central to their identity. And this is actually kind of interesting because for people who are white, it's really not central. You see that 15% of those who identify as white or race is not really central to their identity. Then we asked this question, this is back again in spring of 2019, where you did see Black Americans in particular say someone has acted suspicious of them or as if they weren't, there was a problem. So you see here in various questions we've asked in scenarios, you see that for Black Americans in particular, people acted like they were suspicious of them, people acted like that they weren't smart, being treated unfairly in hiring. You see this across for Black Americans. For Asian Americans, you see that actually 61%, this is again before the pandemic, been subject to slurs or jokes. This is more than any other racial or ethnic group back in 2019. So you already did see signs of discrimination, especially when it had to do with slurs or jokes back in the spring of 2019. But now let me take you to the pandemic. We did this survey this spring. We released it this June. We released it in June, and we found that about 4 in 10 Americans now say it's more common for people to express racist views about people who are Asian than before COVID-19. You see here that those people who are Asian is more common, about 40%, to express racist or racial insensitive views towards them. For Black Americans, they say that it's also about 30% more common, whereas other groups like Hispanics, actually it's about as common as before the pandemic. So this is actually a good measure of was there a change and shift since the pandemic? And you really see this is big especially for Asian Americans and Black Americans. We asked this question, which was similar to the 2019 survey. We found that Asians and Black Americans are more likely than other groups to report negative experiences because of their race or ethnicity since the coronavirus outbreak. So you see that for Asians more than Black Americans, people acted as if they were uncomfortable around them. So 39% of Asian Americans and 38% of Black Americans. And then again, the same question about been subject to slurs or jokes. You saw a 31% of Asian Americans say that this has happened to them because of their race or ethnicity since the coronavirus outbreak. And then also about 26% of Asian Americans have actually feared someone might threaten or physically attack them. So this is pretty much aligned with a lot of the anecdotal stories that we've heard since the coronavirus outbreak in March. And then we also asked are people worry because of their race or ethnicity a great deal or a fair amount, and you see that there's a lot of worry others might be suspicious of them if they wear a mask in public. So you see that about 36% and 42% for Black Americans think that people are suspicious by wearing a mask in public. Then we broke it down kind of about these various measures of adverse experiences, and you see that Black and Asian Americans, again, are most likely to report these adverse experiences due to their race or ethnicity since the coronavirus outbreak began. You see that Asian Americans, 39% of people acted as if they were uncomfortable around them since the coronavirus outbreak, and 38% for Black Americans, and then a little less for whites and Hispanics. Then we also see partisan splits. So we see more Democrats than Republicans say they wore masks in stores all or most of the time. So this is, again, going back to this whole mask debate that we've been having since the coronavirus outbreak, but more especially this summer. In June, we saw that, in the past month, they've worn a mask or face covering when in stores or businesses. You see that actually Asian Americans are more likely than any other group to actually be wearing a mask. And also Democrats are more likely to also wear a mask versus those who are Republican. Then we also ask about people worrying. People will be suspicious if they wear a mask. So again, as I said, the last slide, Asian Americans are more likely to wear a mask, but then also people are more likely to be suspicious of them. So Black and Asian adults are more likely than white and Hispanic adults to worry that people would be suspicious of them wearing a mask. So this is really telling me that, Asian Americans are going to go out there, they're going to wear a mask to protect themselves, but then they're also still have that fear by going to stores. And then Asian and Black Americans, again, are more likely than white and Hispanics to say racism towards a racial ethnic group is more common since COVID-19. So you see that Asians say that, 58%, the majority, say that it's more common for people to express racist or insensitive views about them in our society compared to before the coronavirus outbreak, and more than any other group, actually. So this is actually kind of interesting. You also see Democrats, again, about majority believe this is true, whereas about 25% of Republicans only think the same, that there's been an increase towards discrimination towards those who are Asian. So again, this goes back to a 2019 question, but we asked it this June. We were saying about roughly half of Americans say that Trump still has made race relations worse. So this still hasn't gotten better since the coronavirus outbreak. And you see that Asian Americans actually about 62%, whereas and Black Americans 68%, more than any other group. The two groups, Black and Asians, actually think that Trump has made race relations worse. And this makes sense given his reaction towards coronavirus outbreak, as well as what's been happening since the death of George Floyd and other people since that's been happening. And then here's an interesting finding, because I know that if you remember back in the 1990s, back in Los Angeles, there was a big race riot, or back since the reaction to Rodney King riots, but it's a very different time here. We asked this question about do you support Black Lives Matter? And you see that actually Asians, Hispanics, and of course Black Americans, pretty high majorities of support the Black Lives Matter movement. And if people remember back in the 90s, there were anti-Asian during the Rodney King riots back in Los Angeles. But this is a very different, where you see a lot of support among Asian Americans for BLM movement. So I will end there, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. But I'll now turn it to Marita, or back to I guess to Marita.
Yeah, thank you.
There we go.
And all right, well, without further ado, I will turn it over to our next speaker, Marita, to talk about national efforts to track and respond to hate.
Yes, thank you, Bessie, and thank you, Neil. Am I coming through clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So I have a number of things that I'm here to talk to you about today. So to begin my presentation, here's a roadmap for some of the topics we'll be covering. I know many of you will already be familiar with a lot of the concepts we'll be covering, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to go through some definitions, the legal basis for hate crimes and hate incidents, and we'll focus the bulk of our conversation on the importance of reporting and documentation, share resources, including how one can find assistance, and talk through some of the trainings that we are making available. So let's jump in. Next slide, please. Thank you. So violence committed against individuals because of their personal characteristics has long been a serious problem in the United States. The 2016 election cycle brought a surge in hate against Muslims, Jews, immigrants, refugees, the LGBT community, and people of color. And things have not gotten better over the intervening years. Hate is pervasive in America. Hate incidents touch every demographic and can occur everywhere, from city streets to places of worship to the workplace. Acts of hate devastate not only the individuals that are targeted, they target, divide, and destabilize entire communities, sending a message that some of us are not welcome. Next slide, please. So we know that hate crimes are chronically underreported. The FBI's 2017 hate crimes report documented more than 7,000 criminal incidents that were motivated by bias. These data almost certainly understate the true number of hate incidents committed in our country. Out of more than 16,000 law enforcement agencies that reported to the FBI in 2017, just over 2,000, or less than 13%, reported hate crimes. This means that 87% of the participating law enforcement agencies reported 0 hate crimes in 2017. That's a rather unbelievable measure. We all have a role to play to counter hate. We must speak out against hate and bigotry when we see it and document incidents of hate whenever they arise. Next, please. So the main thing that we're here to talk about today, obviously, has been the rise in anti-Asian hate connected to the coronavirus. Advancing Justice AAJC has been working to raise awareness about increasing racism and discrimination against Chinese Americans, and more broadly Asian Americans, who are being wrongly blamed for the coronavirus and COVID-19. This discrimination is taking many forms, from hostility and suspicion that Asian Americans are carriers of the coronavirus, to verbal abuse, harassment, and even physical violence. So the graphic you see here is an example of just one of the reports submitted to our hate tracker, our Stand Against Hatred website, which we'll be covering in more detail later. And I'm sure people are aware that there have been numerous accounts of serious hate crimes reported in the news. Several members of an Asian family were stabbed in a Sam's Club parking lot in Texas by an individual who believed that the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. In New York City, there have been a number of incidents, including a woman who was attacked with acid thrown at her, and more recently, an 89-year-old Asian woman who was attacked and set on fire. This recent incident actually led to a number of demonstrations in New York City. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned at the top, just to make sure we're on the same page, some definitions. So a hate crime is a traditional criminal offense, like assault, with an added element of bias. So hate crimes are motivated by bias, prejudice, or personal hatred against the actual or perceived characteristics of a victim along the lines listed here: race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, and gender identity. These are typically the types of incidents, hate crimes, which law enforcement might act on. But we also recognize the harm caused by hate incidents, which typically don't involve criminal offenses. So on to the next, please. A hate incident is one that is perceived by the victim or any person as being motivated by prejudice or hate, but does not include an underlying crime. An all too common example is verbal abuse, which we have seen over and over again in the form of people being blamed for the coronavirus or called corona, or people being told to take your virus or your disease and, quote unquote, go back to China. Next slide, please. So there are a number of federal laws on hate crimes, and you will see some of them listed here. But there continue to be serious issues with data collection, reporting, and response, as we've alluded to. Advancing Justice AAJC has been advocating for the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which would improve data collection and reporting by law enforcement agencies, allocate funds for state-run hate crimes hotlines, and includes some measures, restorative justice measures. So this legislation has been inserted into the HEROES Act, which is one of the legislative measures that is intended as COVID-19 relief. The House of Representatives passed the HEROES Act. Unfortunately, it has been languishing with the Senate. The Senate has not taken up or acted on the HEROES Act. So this is a point of advocacy that I urge folks to get active around. Next slide. In addition to federal laws, many states and localities have passed their own hate crime laws, which vary in coverage. The Lawyers Committee's Stop Hate Project has good information on state hate crimes laws, and the link is included here. One point that's important to note is that there are currently 3 states that have no hate crimes laws of their own: Arkansas, South Carolina, and Wyoming. And until recently, the state of Georgia was actually on this list of shame. In June 2020, so just a couple of months ago, Georgia enacted state hate crimes legislation as a result of renewed advocacy efforts following the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Next slide, please. So here's where we'll spend most of our time, talking about the importance of reporting and documentation. Asian Americans Advancing Justice stood up its Stand Against Hatred website in January 2017 in response to the spike in hate crimes and hate incidents at the time. So the website is a collaborative effort of the 5 Advancing Justice affiliates, our DC office, and our affiliates in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Atlanta. As we state on the website, when you report, you are aiding our efforts to monitor hate across the country. By sharing what you experienced or witnessed, you can educate the public, empower others, show service providers where help is needed, and strengthen advocacy efforts for hate crimes response and prevention. Excuse me. And we are deeply grateful to all who have courageously shared their stories. The website has information and can accept reports in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And you can also view excerpts of reports that have been shared with us. Nearly all of the reports that have been submitted this year involve hate crimes, harassment, and discrimination connected to the coronavirus and COVID-19. The majority of these reports involve verbal harassment. In addition, I need to note that we are in communication with organizations that have also been documenting COVID-19 discrimination, including OCA, SALT, and the organizations behind the website Stop AAPI Hate. As of the end of July, our organizations have collectively received more than 2,800 individual reports of harassment and discrimination related to COVID-19. So the reports we receive help us to share information about COVID-19 discrimination and its impact on our community with media and policymakers to help people better understand the problem. And part of the reason why this is so important is because, as you all know, President Trump and other prominent elected officials continue to use the term Chinese virus. As we have been speaking up to oppose this harmful rhetoric, we have had to counter pushback that we are being overly sensitive, too concerned about political correctness. And in response, we have pointed out that numerous experts acknowledge that such labels can cause stigma. And through the reports that have been shared with us, we have been able to offer examples of the very real harm reported by community members who have been subjected to anti-Asian hate. So next slide, please. So in addition to capturing information and encouraging people to share stories, we also recognize the importance of being able to provide resources and help people connect with assistance. So we are really grateful that we are able to partner with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and their Stop Hate project. So as you'll see here, this is the number for their Stop Hate hotline, 1-8449-NO-HATE. And through that hotline, one can be connected with legal assistance and social service support through the Lawyers Committee's network, which extends across the country. Next slide, please. And this is just further information about the Stop Hate project. Our colleagues with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles are providing language support to the Lawyers Committee for individuals seeking assistance who may need help in Asian languages instead of English. So next slide, please. So in addition to the AAPI organizations we work with, we are also part of a much broader civil rights coalition addressing hate. Many of the national civil rights organizations that you are familiar with are members of the Communities Against Hate Coalition. The coalition is anchored by the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Together, we all engage in our own data collection, story collection, and hate tracking efforts, and we share information. And together, the graphic here is the cover of the Hate Magnified report, which was produced in January 2019, which details the reports that we have captured across our various organizations. And I will pause to note that one of the more troubling findings was the number of hate incidents reported that invoked Donald Trump. About 40% of the incidents reported invoked the name of an alt-right hate group, Trump himself, or Trump-related rhetoric. So the members of Communities Against Hate work together to document hate in order to combat the commission of hate crimes and hate violence, drive policy change, advocate for improved response and greater resources, and to change the current narratives that unfortunately are normalizing hate. So next slide, please. So in the face of all of this, we are proud to be able to offer a training that imparts, well, here, let me describe. So we have been partnering with Hollaback, an organization that actually was born out of a desire to address street harassment. Hollaback has developed trainings to respond to and end street harassment, and they contacted us early this spring when the coronavirus was hitting all of our communities hard, and offered to adapt their existing training to addressing anti-Asian hate. And we were very pleased to be able to have something proactive that we could offer to communities. So we very quickly worked to adapt their training. And the first two trainings that we offered in April, we had overwhelming response. Over 1,000 people signed up for each of those. So in order to respond to community need and high demand, we have continued to offer the bystander intervention training since April, and to date we have trained over 15,000 people. Next slide, please. So in partnership with Hollaback, we continue to offer their bystander intervention training, which takes one through different tactics that you can use when you witness or experience hate. The 5 Ds methodology, you can learn more about that by signing up for one of our upcoming trainings. There are several in September. And in addition to the bystander intervention training, we also offer training on conflict de-escalation and a training specifically for our community on how to respond to anti-Asian harassment. So last slide. This wouldn't be complete without a recap of the resources and of course a call to action. We are all scared of the coronavirus. no one should have to also fear that they'll be subject to racist attacks because of it. As we convey in the trainings we do with Hollaback, the safety that we want for Asian American communities is what we should be working to create for all communities, including Black and Brown communities. We are proud that Advancing Justice AAJC has been able to adapt and offer Hollaback's bystander intervention training because it gives us the opportunity to educate people about our Asian American community, our history, and share intervention strategies that can help people feel empowered to act to take care of one another. And if it wasn't clear before, the pandemic has shown us that we have to be in this together. We need to encourage more people in our communities to talk about these issues and to report when they experience and witness anti-Asian hate. We need to share information about resources and where people can get help. There are a number of resources listed on the Advancing Justice AAJC website, including resources on addressing anti-Blackness. We hope that more of you will participate in our trainings with Hollaback and spread the word so that we have more people who are prepared to be upstanders, who will help to build safe spaces for everyone and spread the message that hate, including anti-immigrant hate and coronavirus racism, is unacceptable in all of its forms. And finally, we hope that you will join us in advocating for better laws and policies to address hate, including demanding passage of the Jabara Hire No Hate Act and the HEROES Act. So with that, I will close and pass it back to Bessie.
Thank you, Neil and Marita. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Neil with your key data and findings from the recent survey, and Marita with the many resources to report hate, the hotlines to get legal services support, and also trainings, as well as those very concrete action items. We are now going to open it up to Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, you can type that into the chat box, the questions box, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question directly. And as a reminder, this webinar is recorded, so you'll be receiving a copy of this presentation as well as a link to the recording afterwards. And we'll pause for a minute while questions come in. Neil, one question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about Pew Research Center's other surveys on Asian Americans?
Yes, thanks for that question. So we have not done a survey since I arrived in 2017. So we're hoping to do a new, more in-depth, comprehensive survey of Asian Americans in the coming years. But we haven't done one since before my time back, I think was in 2012. Which I would have definitely done differently from how they did it. But we are gearing up towards a new kind of survey. We do have a lot of demographic work that we've been going through. We do have more comparative work that's coming up. We have a survey, I believe, coming up in the next month, another race survey that will be comparative with Asian Americans and other groups about, I think, early fall, that we'll be releasing that. But nothing, the in-depth survey would be coming up in the next couple of years.
Neil, at the risk of bombarding you, Bessie, may I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Neil, so you alluded in your presentation to some of the limitations with the survey in terms of the Asian American population that was surveyed. Can you delve into that more? Because I know we are always, well, one, concerned about the relative dearth of data in our communities, but also, practices on how to do it well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, this has been a challenge because, as we know, when we I mean, this is now election cycle, and every time you see elections, and then they have race breaks, and you wonder, oh, they have black, white, Hispanic, and then suddenly you're, where are Asians, right? So that has been something that I've been working with here at Pew Research to report more out on Asian Americans in particular. One, it's challenging, as we know, we always get this thing, okay, it's expensive, it's diverse. Asian American community is very diverse. So to do something properly, you need to have the various languages offered, because there are a lot of, is a very heavy immigrant population as well. So people are, majority are foreign born. And if you do not offer the different languages, it could be problematic if you want to say national representative. What we did here, this is more for comparative purposes. It is only in English speaking, but I think the best practices, if you do surveys like what we did here at Pew Research Center, was you have to note and just be clear and transparent of that it was English speaking Asian adults. But it still gives us a really good indication of what's going on. This is something that that is important to put out the facts out there, and that's why we made that decision to make sure that we report out as many racial groups as possible, including Asian Americans.
Thank you. And we have a few follow-up questions. These are for Neil. These questions are from Mail and also Soyun Bueno. Can you explain any differences in data relative to geographic regions or areas, for example, urban versus rural, suburbs versus inner cities, etc.? Also, do you have any thoughts about why Hispanic may indicate lower numbers relative to Black and Asian groups in your studies? And then also lastly, what was the sample size of the research? And also for future research on the economic impact of COVID-19 on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Good, great question. So first I'll start with sample size. So in order for us to, when we report out, it's all detailed in the methodology, but it's detailed technical. But just the short answer is the sample size is 10,000. So it's a pretty big sample, and that does allow us to get effective sample size that we're comfortable with reporting about with English-speaking Asian adults. So it's a 10,000 sample size. For why Hispanics, that's actually very interesting. That was an interesting finding for us because we were wondering, but it also kind of tells us contextually what has been going on. We know that the two big shocks since, for 2020 has been the pandemic and then the death of George Floyd. Those two things, and that as we're seeing here on the survey that we did in June, those two groups who've been most impacted by those two pandemics in terms of discrimination have been kind of up to the, you could see here they've increased in terms of the discrimination as well, so Asian and Black Americans. So for Hispanics, it doesn't mean that they're not getting discriminated against, but the way we ask that question is, has there been an increase of discrimination or adverse experiences since the coronavirus virus outbreak? And as we know, anti-immigrant sentiment has been there even before the pandemic. So it hasn't increased since then, since there's actually not that much migration going on now since the pandemic. But these two, so that's not surprising how Hispanics has not gone up, but it doesn't mean they're not getting discriminated against, because it's just they're not as common. There hasn't been an increase, it's just as common as before the pandemic. And then for urban rural, we don't have that split, unfortunately. We were able to split in terms of age, where we did see younger have more likely to have more experience with discrimination than those who are older, so under 50 versus over 50. The reason why is probably younger people are more likely moving around during the pandemic, whereas elderly are less likely to be moving around during the pandemic, given the risk of catching COVID-19 during for older people, or the adverse effects in terms of getting sick. So I think that that makes sense. We don't have the urban rural split, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. A question for Marita. This is from Dennis Cow. I think it's important to also consider the negative effects of racism and discrimination on one's physical and mental health. Even those who don't experience hate crimes or incidents may feel more stressed or anxious. The stress can eventually lead to diminished health or mental health. Are any groups focused on addressing these issues?
So thank you for that question. I absolutely agree. I will say that one of the limitations that we ran up against when trying to compile national resources to responding to discrimination and harassment was that there are limited resources in this space, right? So I think that's an area where clearly more work is needed. We need more resources and more organizations leaning into this. If anyone's aware of organizations, I encourage you to share the information. I will say that New York, which obviously has been the epicenter of the coronavirus from early on, they have stood up their own Office of Human Rights, their own hate crimes hotline, and they also have, I think it's statewide, a mental health hotline. So not necessarily dealing specifically with discrimination, but just with all impacts of the coronavirus and COVID-19. So that is one really good example that, if it hasn't already been, I hope would be emulated by other states across the country.
Thanks, Marita. I would also add the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association, or NAPIMA. They have a great list of resources, which include AA and HPI service providers and also COVID-19 resources on their webpage, and that's at napima.org, NAAPIMHA.org. And then also in the training series that Marita had mentioned that we've been doing with Hollaback, that third training series is focused on how to respond to racism. And part of that includes talking about how to practice resilience with yourself, with your relationships, with your community, and more. And so we try to address some of the mental health aspects in the experience that people have when they either experience harassment or witness harassment, or just know that it's coming up in their community. So I definitely recommend folks who are interested in learning more to join those trainings. And again, you can find that information at ihollaback.org/bystander intervention. And then another question for you, Marita. Is there an infographic that folks can access with data or findings from the reporting trackers for hate incidents and hate crimes?
That is an excellent question. So there are a number of groups that are engaged in this work, and we all have been sharing information in different ways. So if you go to standagainsthatred.org, we regularly post excerpts from some of the reports that have been shared with us. But that's the extent of the information we've been sharing so far. Stop AAPI Hate, they have issued a number of, I guess, some analysis of the reports that were submitted to them. I think most of those are from earlier on in the pandemic, when the reports were coming in fast and furious. I'm not sure if they have published a report recently, but that would be a good starting point. And certainly all of us continue to talk about how we can share information and perhaps collaborate on something like this, because we recognize that people are interested in more information, and in particular trying to understand any patterns. Yeah.
Thank you. And then one additional question for you, Marita. With new immigrant groups like Karen, Karenni, Chin, Kutch, and Rohingya, do you know whether or not they face more COVID-19 discrimination and hate more than other more visible Asian groups? This question is from Adrienne Chanton.
No, thank you for the question. You know, from the information that we have received, it's mostly from Chinese Americans or people who are mistakenly identified as Chinese. And let's face it, most people in the general public can't really tell us apart. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the discrimination is limited to Chinese Americans. From the reports we've received, I would say that, you know, all segments of our communities have been harassed. Now, whether some of the more recently arrived groups are coming in for more, I don't have information to respond to that one way or another. And I think part of that is because these are still relatively small populations in our country. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And then one last question. This is from Roland Huang. Will you be able to go out on the road to give this webinar live on campuses? Any plans? And I can take that question. Roland, I think that this will be the one webinar we have on this survey with Neil and Marita, but it is recorded, and so we encourage folks to share this recording with their networks. I don't know, Neil, if you want to share any plans that Pew Research Center has around your surveys, or Marita, any of the outreach that we're doing more on our anti-hate coming up in the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to help present in other avenues or other places, and we will have more content throughout the year. Every month we usually have a new survey on a topic. It might not be about discrimination, but we'll have different topics that would have, it breaks on Asian Americans as well. So I'm more than happy to be helping with for a roadshow if you need, or any talks. Thanks.
Yes, Roland, that's a great question. I would be happy to also replicate some portions of this presentation for other groups through a virtual roadshow, right? We're not actually going anywhere in the foreseeable future, but sure, if you think there are more audiences that would benefit from this information. Neil and I might not be able to do this together moving forward. Like Bessie said, the recording is available, but I mean, he will continue to share information, and I am happy to do so also.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our questions. So everyone, thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for Neil and Marita for sharing all their resources and information with us. So I included 2 links on this slide for some of the resources that Marita had shared. But first of all, if you've experienced hate, discrimination, or harassment, or you've witnessed it, please consider sharing your story at standagainsthatred.org to help us monitor and track hate against Asian American communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are 2 resources listed here, and I will also send these out via email. Please visit our COVID-19 webpage for resources to respond to racism, xenophobia, and hate during this COVID-19 pandemic. And also, please see our resources for the Asian American community on combating anti-Blackness in our communities. This page has a list of resources, reading lists, and more on anti-racism and anti-Blackness for the Asian American community. And again, the copy of this presentation and the recording of this webinar will be circulated after this webinar concludes in the next few days. So thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have any follow-up questions, I've included contact information for both of our speakers on this slide. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be ending the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.